Um, okay, cool. So I'm going to talk today about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is product design process. How many people here, like on a regular basis, work with a designer or identify as a designer? Cool. Well, how many people are designers? Anyone? Actually, you're all designers, so you're going to learn that. But okay, cool. So yeah, I don't know if there are folks who are here kind of on a team of one or are responsible for a lot of the design process. But my goal is to either get the people who are designers in your organization a big raise by helping you understand their value or increasing their scope of responsibility, or if you don't have a designer, feeling sufficient without one because you've learned so much, or firing your existing one because they're doing a bad job. So anyway, I'm Trevor. I work at a startup in Menlo Park, California, that some people may have heard of. On Twitter, I'm sometimes active. I read a lot. I don't necessarily always tweet. I found that the more time I spend on Twitter, the more temptation I have to be political, which is toxic, so I try not to. So first I want to start by talking about kind of this fundamental dichotomy we think about, at least when we think about product development, and sort of stereotyped by these typefaces, right, of design versus development, sort of posture that way. Is it, do you have budget in your engineering process for design? But I want to start by kind of talking about some things I think are myths, and then sort of talking about how we can, why the sort of counterpoints to these myths are true. So first, design is expensive. And I say that building your product twice is actually far more expensive, right? So design can help clarify what you're building and help you arrive at that outcome. Design is time consuming. It might add weeks or months to your product development process. But I say that design helps you achieve product market fit faster through iteration and research. So actually, overall, the time to having a successful product is shortened. And then lastly, designers are divas. And I actually say this is absolutely true. Designers are divas, so we'll take that. So in order to kind of talk about what we're going to talk about, I want to define some terms. So agree on some definitions and premises on which I'm going to build this talk. But since I'm the only one with a mic, I just have to agree with myself, so this should be pretty easy. So design is the creation of a plan or convention for the construction of an object, system, or measurable human interaction. So design is a very broad discipline. You think about architecture, or urban planning, or graphic design, or industrial design. It's all these things, but fundamentally, this is what it is, right? So when we talk about products, we're talking about, in marketing, a product is anything that can be offered to a market that might satisfy a need or want. So traditionally, we may not think of software as a product, but that's kind of how I've learned to think about it. You have software that sort of is very product-oriented. Something like Uber is offering a product that meets a need, right? Something like Amazon, you're literally buying products via a software product, right? But something like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, these are not really things that are intuitively thought about as products, but they can be understood as such because they are meeting a market's want or need. So the way that I think about product design, it's really a set of methodologies and processes to intentionally arrive at a successful outcome. And intentionally is important because everything you do in design has consequences, right? Even not doing something has consequences. People often say, why does Facebook have 400 designers? Is Facebook even designed, right? But the neutrality of a system is a property of it that is designed. Ultimately, though, we're talking about this in the context of product development. So it's not as though you're just arriving at a successful outcome in life. It's product design. No, we're talking about something scoped. So the way that I think about this is sort of you have a problem and then you have a desired outcome. The solution is a bridge that is sort of gets across that chasm from the problem to the outcome you want. So some concrete examples. If you look at a problem like email is unmanageable and people's inboxes stress them out. The outcome you want is that people feel in control of email and use it stress-free. If we look at some products that have tried to solve this, you think about something like Gmail, which first was revolutionary because they bundled emails. Then they had these separate inboxes for social and all these other things. And then you think about something like Inbox, which is more contemporary. And what they do really well is two things. One, they never show number labels, ever. So you might have 10,000 unread emails, but all of a sudden you don't feel stressed out about it. Because hitherto, a lot of products feature prominently your unread count, but Inbox tries to not do that. They also made search really, really great, and they try to bundle things and elevate things in a timely fashion. You think about something like Mailbox, rest in peace. was something that was really primarily focused on using gestures and really design innovations to make it more fun to manage email. So actually, not really an innovation other than it's less tedious. All these things are potential solutions to this problem, but they're very, very different. So we want a design process that facilitates exploration of those things. So when I think stereotypically about sort of designers and developers, I think about these sort of core skills perhaps that these disciplines represent. So designers are focused on research and understanding stuff and drawings, so visual design, iteration, developing a lot of solutions, and sort of personas, which maybe are stories about humans that sort of guide their thinking. Developers, I think about implementation, like software engineering, data science, being able to sort of understand, dive into data, understand trends, really use inquiry. Machine learning, being able to do ranking and like have a really smart feed or something like this. And then performance optimization, so like making things really fast. When I really reflected on this though, when I think about my relationship with developers over the years, and as someone I actually studied computer science for 2 years, I realized like I've borrowed so much from your discipline that I actually like feel sort of indebted in a way because like as a designer, I learned to build software in order to build my prototypes. I need to be competent with data science to work with my analysts to be able to actually ask them the right questions to get answers about how our products are being used. I need to be competent in machine learning and models to be able to make like smart ranking systems or give people the information they want in a timely fashion. And obviously we want our products to be fast and performant, which is like first and foremost a user experience concern. So my goal in sort of all of this is like, I feel like I've borrowed so much from engineering discipline that I want to like share how I think design and design process can ultimately help us all together to arrive at more successful product outcomes, which ultimately results in better products for humans, right? We all have the privilege of making things for people, which is like, we get paid to do this. We get paid to like solve people's problems and make like cool things. And I think that's awesome. This is a quote from an article from Julie Zhu, who's one of our product design directors. And this is when she talks about basically not calling people who use your products users. And this is something at first I kind of rolled my eyes at, and then I realized it actually functions pretty well for you because it grounds you in the idea that there's a human on the other end of a piece of software who has problems and needs and goals. And if you can focus on them and deliver an experience that's compelling and solves their problem, like you're not just doing your job and making money, but like you're actually doing something good, right? So this is kind of what we think about when we think about products, is something that's useful to a person. And so I'm going to try, I probably will still mess up because I do every day, but I'm going to try to talk about the people who use products as people. So some of you probably, most of you work with designers. So people are probably first and foremost familiar with like visual designers, like UI designers, people who are drawing sort of UI that then gets constructed. You might also have a role like interaction designer, which some people call UX designers. These are people who are designing end-to-end flows. They're deciding how interfaces are laid out, how components work together. You might have a motion designer, so the person who designed something like the Twitter like button or reactions on Facebook. Things like this, like parts of your interface that are sort of moving that are traditionally handled by a more like animation-oriented person to consider motion design. You might also have a prototyper. So this would be on really big teams where you have the privilege of someone who works between engineers and designers to bring designers' ideas to life and evaluate them. You might also have an information architect. This is someone who's focused on the hierarchy of content and how like a product's modeled. So these are like, there are other companies that literally have all these roles in a team. At Facebook, we have one role, and it's called product designer, and we do all of those things. Unfortunately, it does not mean I get paid 5 times as much as any one of those roles, but maybe eventually. So the core competencies when we talk about product designers are visual design, interaction design, and product thinking. So to put a concrete example to this, if we look at Spotify, here we have like, if you think about visual design, you think about like the green stroke and the typeface that's selected and the weights that are used. When you think about interaction design, you might think about that caret at the upper left, what happens when you tap it, right? But when you think about product thinking, which I think is the most kind of rare skill and it's not really taught in design schools. It's understanding a product in the context of its business and its strategy. It's sort of an acknowledgement that this is something that's solving a problem in a particular context. So the examples here would be the fact that there's no way to really play these playlists. The green button says shuffle play, right? That's a strategy. That's a strategy of Spotify. When you open Spotify, you see Discover Weekly, you see all these dynamic playlists. That's a strategy of the organization to kind of get you to cede control to the machine, right? If you notice the My Library tab, which traditionally is like what music listening has been about, is the 5th tab all the way on the right. All of their tabs are focused on exploration and sort of trusting Spotify's recommendations. So those are all intentional design decisions that are made that are part of the organization's like strategy and business goals that are carried out by a designer. That's what we talk about when we talk about product thinking. So again, something near and dear to my heart is process. And a designer's process is really just a way of organizing and applying their skills and methodologies within a project flexibly. And that word flexibly is key because I'm going to talk about a lot of techniques and sort of stories and whatever, but ultimately it's just important that, in my opinion, like what I would be happy if like anyone really, one person, but if most people walked out of here with something sort of actionable to do in their product development process that incorporated some element of design process to make better outcomes or cheaper outcomes, something positive. Yeah, these aren't really processes that should constrain or dictate you or your team, and just apply them where they make sense and disregard them where they don't. So designers' favorite thing to do, I say, is to draw process diagrams. So this is something from a book that's all about design discovery. Here's a key idea that we'll touch on is like convergent and divergent thinking. Here's another one that sort of like models the design process in terms of these like diamonds where it represents converging and diverging. But this is pretty common. This is where the guy got it from. It's like a way more fleshed out version. And this one I really like because it talks about it in terms of deliverables, so like what a designer is actually providing. So these are all, also by the way, all these slides will be available, so like don't stress about getting all this right here. But all of them have this kind of pattern of like this idea of understanding something and then like making something, right? They're like understanding is key to feeding into a successful solution. So here's like someone with like kind of like a straw man process and like what process really looks like. Here's one from Zerb, which is a product design studio in California that has done a lot too to popularize the ideas we'll talk about. They have this is our old process and this is our new process. It's streamlined, right? This is from my manager, Tom Broxton, who is brilliant. He's British, and he sort of does this too, where he has this straw man. Like this is like how we think about process, but like this is what it's like in practice. You know, like you're all over the place and it's like hard to follow. You know, then he sort of crystallizes this with he kind of fits this into this mold of this understand, model, build, and launch. But also one thing I think is funny is like I said, there's nothing designers love more than drawing process diagrams. But like if we look back at this, I think like the only thing they love more than designing process diagrams is like redesigning process diagrams, because like we have a lot of like straw man process diagrams. But anyway, so I like his examples of understand, model, build, launch. We're going to leave launch out of it for now, just because launch I think is more about marketing and positioning something for success and sort of like a cohesive narrative, which like you kind of want, but it's really we're unconcerned with it. So I'm going to zoom in on understand, model, and build, and we're going to look at each of those. So understand is about defining the problem, and I would say in terms of actual skills and application, this phase is primarily characterized by research. Research in the domain or the problem space or defining it further. Next is model is about representing, you want to model potential solutions and represent them visually. So this is what like at Facebook we usually call craft and execution. Some people call it visual design. Whatever it is, it's representing a product visually, and this is like the kind of this is like when you think about designers, you think about this is the work they're doing ultimately. And then building. This is where you all are crucial. Designers may be able to code or prototype their own work, but very often we rely on engineers to bring our solutions to life in a way that's testable. And then I would say the most important part of this process is like iterative, is the iterative part of this. So I would, like you all are engineers, like think about this like recursion. Like this process sort of just keeps going and going and going until like ideally you have a successful product outcome. But by no means this is a linear thing. This is something that's happening over and over again, and iteration is ultimately happening probably within each of these phases. So let's talk about the first component, understand. So this is where we define the problem to be solved, and I'm going to try to start each of these 3 phases of design process with like a sort of example to illustrate this. So in 1994, Procter & Gamble hired a design agency called Continuum, and they were tasked with find a better way to clean floors in the home. At the time, their home cleaning products were mainly detergents because most folks already owned a mop and bucket, and they just sort of, that's how they clean the floor. So they're competing bitterly with the other detergent companies for a pretty limited market. And most of their products were pretty simple, but they were focused holistically as an organization on new products for this season. They wanted like $5 billion in revenue or something across all their product lines. And so they wanted some of the new detergents to be created. And when the ethnographers from Continuum arrived at the homes they were going to, they noticed something interesting, which was that all the floors were already clean upon arrival, even though the subjects knew that ethnographers were coming specifically to study floors and how they clean them and stuff. But they cleaned them anyway, just as they would with any guest coming to their home, right? And this was the key insight because they realized that the floor in the home was a reflection of the self. And they found that the more they studied, homemakers felt a sense of value about themselves and their families when their floor was clean. The tricky part, though, is that cleaning the floor is actually really tedious and hard work. And at the time, they noticed people changing into old clothes, and then they would broom and dustpan, and like in the process, they'd spend as long wringing out the mop as they would actually mopping. And this helped Continuum realize that they don't need to like make a detergent or like fix one of these components. They need to like fundamentally fix mopping as a process. They need to like replace it. So the entire process is broken, and they knew it wasn't just about detergent, right? So what resulted ultimately was Swiffer. This was a creation which is now a $500 million a year business for P&G. And the Swiffer was ultimately a result of an intentional design process and qualitative research. A particular type of qualitative research we would call contextual inquiry, which is a methodology where a researcher observes a subject accomplishing one or more tasks in the context in which those tasks are ordinarily completed. So this leads us to principle 1, which each will have one principle to accompany sort of each part of the process, which is that successful products require clearly defined problems. So it's up to you as sort of a designer or a sort of maker within the context of product development to define what the problem is you're solving. And this is key because remember we talked about a product being a bridge between a problem and a solution. And if you don't actually know what the outcome you want is and what the problem you're solving, it's going to be really difficult to evaluate your solution down the road. So let's talk about a concrete example. So let's imagine you're a designer at Twitter. So here's Twitter for iOS. It's reasonable you could be approached with something like, people are tweeting less, or we want people to tweet more. These things sound like problems, but how would you actually go about solving them? So let's dive into this. So here's a hypothetical we're tasked with, which is that we want people to tweet more. I'm sure that people have been tasked with something similarly this broad in your organization. You have a metric that's going in the wrong direction. You have to fix it. But this doesn't really describe a problem. It describes an outcome. Saying people don't tweet enough really could be describing several sub-problems. But how do we get at these sub-problems, right? So you want to ask the right questions. And I do think this is a matter of sort of skill, but ultimately just feel free to kind of ask questions and figure out how you'll answer them. I can think of a few off the top of my head, which is, are people expressing intent to tweet but failing to? Are people having difficulty discovering how to tweet? Are people having difficulty knowing what to tweet? Are people feeling uncomfortable at the prospect of tweeting? Are people getting significant value out of Twitter without tweeting? And all these questions ultimately can be answered at the start of this process while you're understanding. And how we do that? Well, we can do that with research, right? So I have this kind of pyramid of research methodologies. When we talk about research, we talk about these are kind of sub-methodologies and distinctions, and this is kind of a cursory diagram I made. The two core distinctions to make is qualitative and quantitative, which I think people are probably pretty familiar with. I have researchers that I work closely with that are really smart and PhDs and handle all this for me, so I just have to ask them things and they figure it out. And they probably barf at this too. But this is probably good enough for characterizing these things broadly. So qualitative research acquires information sort of in non-numerical forms. These would be things like open-ended questionnaires, observation of participants, card sorting, affinity diagramming, all things to garner qualitative information that's multidimensional and rich, but ultimately you have to keep in mind is highly subjective because it's limited in scope and it's people with opinions. So within qualitative research also, we've distinguished between generative and evaluative. So generative is about discovering new problems or clarifying existing problems. Evaluative is about kind of understanding how successful an existing solution is like at solving something, right? So usability testing, example of evaluative research. Whereas generative research is more what Continuum was doing for P&G, where they go into the home and they're trying to like discover new opportunities. And then within quantitative, we distinguish between, quantitative is data that's numerical, something you can quantify, obviously. So here I distinguish between logging and surveys, because logging is something like querying an existing table, asking how many people are going to this tab, or like what's the probability if someone goes to this screen that they're going to convert, which is different than survey-based data, which is oftentimes much more limited in terms of actual like response rate or availability, and again is highly subjective. The design of a survey is very influential over the data you get. So you could have leading or misleading questions that result in data that could be misinterpreted or misunderstood, et cetera. Whereas logging is kind of more just like just straight up facts. And you might ask the wrong questions, but the answers aren't really going to be misleading unless you are interpreting them incorrectly. So if we go back to this, how could we answer some of these questions like using our research methodologies? Right? So are people trying and failing to tweet? So these are like concrete examples, I think, of how you can start to think about, again, applying these ideas to test your products. So I could run a query to see how many people open Composer and type and then close Composer. I could also see how many people save drafts and then don't tweet. This would be quant data, so examining logs and querying existing tables to identify and solve a problem. Or identify a problem to solve, rather. How about, are people having difficulty discovering how to tweet? So I could use qualitative, evaluative research to bring people in and test the existing usability of the Composer and discover whether people are having trouble with it. How about, are people having difficulty knowing what to tweet? So I could run a query to find out whether there are people spending substantial time on Composer without typing, and then try to recruit them for interviews, which would be qualitative, generative research. How about, are people feeling uncomfortable tweeting? Well, I could survey those people en masse and ask if they feel comfortable tweeting, quant survey, and then follow up by recruiting those who've responded in a particular manner to actually come in and do qualitative generative research. And then lastly, are people getting significant value out of Twitter without tweeting? So I could use quantitative research to examine, are there users who have a significant amount of time spent but very rarely compose tweets? And then I could maybe understand further, like why aren't they tweeting, et cetera, right? But these are all methodologies that you have at your disposal to understand sort of patterns within your products or discover opportunities for new products. So again, define clearly your problem and what product success looks like, right? So in the case of, let's say we find that a lot of people are typing Composer and then not tweeting, that you could actually construct a reasonable sort of problem and solution from there, right? So the solution is, abandonment rate goes down on Composer or something. So the problem is people are abandoning Composer. The outcome is like we reduce our abandonment rate or increase amongst people who have this behavior, increase the probability they'll tweet, something like this. But the important thing is once you have the outcome defined, everything else that we're going to do, we can evaluate against it, right? Because again, we talk about intentionality in design. Everything comes back to what's the problem you're solving. Again, that's what we talk about when we talk about product design. I think there's a misconception in like designers are about like making things pretty, but like there's that Steve Jobs quote which everyone throws around. It's like design's about solving problems, and that's definitely true. So we want to have our problem and outcome defined so we can evaluate our solutions against it. So nextly, and probably the most important part of this process, like what you stereotypically think about with designers, is model. So we want to represent possible solutions visually. So this past fall, I had the privilege of traveling to Asia and going to Japan for Tokyo Design Week. I fell in love with the city of Tokyo as someone interested in kind of architecture and urban planning. It was like fascinating to me as an amateur photographer as well. There's like a lot of opportunities to just photograph people and buildings and amazing stuff. And of course, I did what everyone does when they go to Tokyo. They go to Snoopy Museum, right? That's like what you think of when you think of Tokyo. Like, I'm going to go to Tokyo to go to the Snoopy Museum. But actually, like, I was kind of surprised. There's a museum dedicated to Snoopy, like, in Tokyo, and like people love it. So I don't know. Is like is Snoopy a thing from like the States, or like is everyone kind of universally familiar with Snoopy and like the Peanuts and stuff? Oh gosh, this might be hard. But this like museum was sort of fascinating to me. So this was like Schultz's very first sketch of the character Snoopy, which looks nothing like what the character eventually ends up looking like. And this is the very first comic strip too, where like the humor is sort of based on this idea that Snoopy is following, Charlie Brown and whatever, and he's going to whatever. But Snoopy can't talk. He walks on all fours and does very dog-like things, which is ultimately not what we think of when we think of Snoopy, right? So Snoopy as a character evolved over literally decades. And as I explored the museum, I saw how the Snoopy, who I guess is a product, evolved through the decades. He stands up, he starts to talk, he becomes a world-famous attorney, a doctor, a flying ace, and so many more things. He sleeps on top of his doghouse rather than in it. And Schultz defines Snoopy's character gradually, changing his actions and illustration style all along the way. In the process, he turns from a standard kind of dog to an anthropomorphized one with remarkable cynicism and perception trapped inside his canine exterior. And walking through the museum and experiencing the gradual evolution of a character I thought I knew so well was stunning as a designer, as an example of iteration and sort of a breadth of ideas, which leads us to our second principle. More ideas are better. This is Michael Beirut's The Legendary Pentagram Designer sketchbook, who worked on Hillary Clinton's branding campaign and was widely regarded as a success. The branding campaign, that is. So here are also sketches of mine, of friends of mine that are industrial designers of like a bottle or something, and this is one for a bag that was about like financial responsibility and containing money. This was a pepper mill. Like these are, I can't draw like this, unfortunately. I was an industrial designer. But the way you creatively and ultimately arrive at successful solutions is not by thinking hard and working linearly. It's about generating a breadth of ideas as quickly and cheaply as possible. These are examples of early designs of reactions from Facebook, which can be found at, there'll be a link I'll link to where you can find all these examples. But I think this is interesting because you can, again, see the journey of the illustrators and designers as they went through the various styles, and each one of these has an effect on how people feel when they use it. Here's an example of how it actually looks in feed stories with these treatments applied. So this kind of gets at a principle that I think is important for designers in sort of the modeling stage, which is yes and. Most of you are familiar with the idea of sprints because they're a part of software development. You might characterize a project in terms of a number of sprints or something. But designers actually have sprints too. It's kind of trendy and controversial now. Like some people are like sprints are dumb, and some people are like sprints saved our organization's life. But ultimately, I find sprints to be a useful way of focusing a team around a problem and kind of getting non-designers to participate in the design process. I've led sprints, and I do find them valuable. But one of the things we say as a ground rule for these, we'll have an entire day of brainstorming, is yes and. So that's kind of like a principle from improv where basically it's the idea of building on your own and others' ideas to foster a more creative, dynamic, and collaborative outcome. We call this sort of phrase divergent thinking. So eventually you and your team is going to converge around a limited number of ideas or themes. But first, it's important to just have this sort of yes and mindset and kind of diverge and create as many ideas as possible. This can be done by an individual in a drawing application like Sketch, on paper or in a whiteboard as a team, in a workshop. It doesn't matter the medium. Eventually, we converge. We have a set of solutions, and we evaluate them systematically, goaled against how we think the solution will help us or a team affect the outcome we want. This process is called critique, and this is another core part of design process. It's really important to a healthy team. Critique is an old tradition within design as a broad discipline. It can be formal or informal. And in school, it's where students cry because they're professors and eventually learn to separate themselves from their work. And that's not an exaggeration. Like, architecture is notoriously brutal in critique. Like, my father's an architect, and like I had friends who are architects, and like you have like professors like, what is this? And like breaking people's models and stuff, and like people are crying. It's bad. But anyway, the result though is like you view your work as an object and not an extension of yourself. So like you could bring something like this, which is Frankie's design narrations of the original version of Live, which was only within mentions, which is like the celebrity product. You might go into this with a critique, and like you have a goal that you have something it's goaled against, and you evaluate all the decisions he's made based on that as a team. So I'm going to skip through this because it's just because I'm not sure how we'll be on time. But basically, like here's an exercise I do with people where we talk about like we sort of critique this in a very cursory fashion, and we talk about like what is each of these products trying to achieve. You look at Instagram promoting the photos prominently. You look at the New York Times adding these sort of scannable titles, right? You look at Pinterest with no hierarchy to encourage people to explore. All these products are feeds, but they have different goals that they're trying to achieve. And they're generally probably pretty well designed. So again, principle 2, more ideas are better. And this applies not just in divergent thinking where we generate more ideas, but in convergent thinking and in critique when we narrow our ideas. And we have a saying at Facebook that feedback's a gift and that anything can help you fill in a blind spot or realize what you don't know. And that's crucial. And you should welcome this insight even if it can be difficult to hear at first, which brings me to a slight modification of principle 2, which I feel very strongly about, which is that more perspectives are vital. I don't know if you remember this, but everyone knows that technology struggles with diversity, and ideally we accept that it's not a benign struggle. We get to make stuff, we get to solve people's problems, and ultimately help them achieve meaningful outcomes in their daily lives. And we get paid to do this. The reality, though, is not everyone you make products for is going to look like or behave like you do. Not everyone will have a high-end phone. Not everyone will be the same race or gender orientation as you. So being able to design these experiences is a skill you have to gain called empathy, right? So these are examples of severe lack of empathy. Empathy is being able to understand and share the feelings of another person. So having a diverse team can help you develop empathy and catch product oversights and unconscious bias before it occurs. Is everyone familiar with this example? I don't know if this is just a thing in the States, but basically it's like hijacking sort of like highly sensitive institutional racism imagery in service of like Pepsi and Kylie Jenner, and like this was met with like just general like everyone's like this is bad, this is dumb, and Pepsi was like what the heck, we wanted to like celebrate whatever. And my question is like how many people on this team were like considerate of like these other ideas and these perspectives, and probably not many. This is an example, a screenshot from an article from a brilliant colleague and team member of mine, Beth Dean, and she talks about, she kind of cautions us to design, to be considerate of what she calls emotional intelligence in design, which is that we can damage the people who use our products if we aren't sort of sensitive. Her mother passed away when she was a child, and she gives examples of Mother's Day advertisements to security questions like these of how she's hurt every day by decisions designers and engineers have made, right? So this is a security question where it's asking her to verify her dead mother as like a contact, right? Which is like unfortunate, but she encounters this every day. And software products are very just in general negligent of sort of the intricacies of our lives and what's going to bother us. So practicing empathy is avoiding stuff like this. Considering how having a drop-down for gender with 2 options affects those who don't identify in that manner. And consider how your security questions could sadden someone like Beth. Consider how the photography and illustrations in your products could make someone feel if they don't feel like they belong or are similar to what they're seeing. The flip side of this is you can foster a positive relationship between your brand and product and your customers. This is an article by a designer at Slack who's black, who used a brown hand in product illustration and received positive feedback from customers who noted how awesome it felt to see emoji with skin tone like theirs for once used in marketing. At Facebook, we have product marketing stuff we have available with hands of like different ages, genders, and skin tones of people holding devices. And we had these photographs in order to be able to use them in marketing materials and prototypes so that we're reminded that our community doesn't always look like us. We also released a massive library of photorealistic devices in Sketch and as images so you can preview your designs on any device. And the Thunderbolt display you see is drawn by me, and it took me 40 hours. We specifically included feature phones because our products are used all over the world by lots of people who don't have high-end smartphones and still use feature phones. These people deserve an experience too if we can deliver it, and it's important for us to be mindful of that. But how do we do it? So I've talked really abstractly about products, solutions, etc., and I want to get a bit more tactical. And truthfully, I did scope it back because I know there's a gentleman talking after me who's going to talk all about visual design more tactically. And kind of to troll him in his talk, I watched a bit of it, and he talked about not using 100% black or white, so I used 100% black and white. So Apple's HIG, most people I'm assuming are familiar with this. This provides an incredible library of patterns and components and additional design guidelines and writings around them. then Facebook has made these iOS UI, like kind of UI kits for Sketch and Figma and XD and Photoshop, and that can be used. I'm one of the more technical designers involved in the project, and I actually built an app that was basically every permutation of UI kit, like all the standard components, like nav bars and segmenting controllers and all these different things, so that we could take screenshots of them, draw them photorealistically, and then provide developers and designers a toolkit with which they can kind of actually lay out their applications. I mean, I know if you can figure out like Swift and all this stuff, like you can figure out Sketch, but it's probably still faster to lay stuff out in Sketch than it is to do it in storyboards and build it and stuff. So our component system allows you to have kind of one-to-one mappings in these design applications of what the actual software kind of equivalent of these components are. So you can kind of build, you can, even as a non-designer, start to put this stuff together. Material design is Google's essentially version of the HIG, which I'm again assuming most folks are familiar with. I'd highly recommend anyone who designs for Android go through these resources exhaustively if you haven't. And Google also has a kind of Sketch library that you can, that's the same thing essentially that Facebook's made for iOS, they have for Android. So again, it should be really easy to get up and running. And also, just a note on Sketch, like that's the application that I prefer and that most designers that I work with regularly are using to design. And so these patterns are important. So these are two books I found to be fairly influential. I wouldn't not recommend reading them in their entirety. Some people who are engineers here might be familiar with these references. This was in the 70s. A guy named Chris Alexander wrote a series of architecture books where he sort of invented the idea of a design pattern. So software developers here might know like OOP and like factory pattern and observer pattern, all these things. And this sort of comes from this idea from this book where he kind of laid out this vision of like, oh, if we can only abstract all the solutions to like daily life and like building cities and houses and everything, then like we would never, like everyone would be able to essentially invent their own solutions. Which is like kind of cool, but also it applies to software, where basically if we can have these agreed upon patterns, we can focus on the real problems we want to solve, right? So like having a user select an option from a list is a solved problem, right? Like UI action sheet. But having a user that needs to report abuse in the context of a social network is not a solved problem. It might have UI components of that are solved problems like an action sheet, but the overall flow is what as designers or kind of makers we want to focus on. So to recap this section, just because it was a lot, we want to iterate to diverge. We want to critique and converge. We want to make sure to practice empathy and understand that there's a human at the other end of our products. And we want to embrace design patterns to make things sort of faster. And ultimately, we're communicating to people using our products in a vocabulary that they're familiar with. So lastly, build. You want to implement your solution in a way that's testable. So this last story comes from, is this playing right now? I don't think so. Yeah. So this last story comes from a film I'm assuming most folks are familiar with, which is Steven Spielberg's Minority Report. I guess it was Spielberg, right? Yeah. Anyway, it was sort of like candy for UI designers at the time, where Tom Cruise controls a futuristic projection-like thing in physical space with some gloves or something, and it's like all manipulated gesturally, and his movements are choreographed beautifully. He demonstrably sets about his task of solving this murder before it ever happens, and it's a remarkable scene because of the drama for sure, but also because of the UI. People saw this and assumed it'd be the future. We had products result indirectly from this, like line of thinking and the explosion of theoretical gestural UI, like the Magic Leap, or even the Wii. People, I'm sure, remember like when the Wii first came out, everyone was like throwing it through their TVs or whatever. So this is like a really nice idea, but most people fail to realize that in reality, Tom Cruise had to take breaks on set because he was acting out this UI was exhausting. So this is exactly the sort of effect on a person that using a product this is exactly what you'd expect if a designer or a writer or whomever made up some solution outside of the context of like when it's actually being used and never tested it. So this brings us to our final principle, which is that learning can in and of itself be a successful outcome. Many times people approach the building phase as sort of the launching phase or the shipping phase where a solution's constructed. Champagne flows, cash rains down from the sky, and people leave 5-star reviews for your app. But in reality, this is rarely the case. Instead, I found it's more important to focus your effort on the building phase on learning as much as possible and quickly reapplying those learnings, I hate that word, but everyone uses it, so to your process, starting back at understanding and updating your problem and outcome statements of what you've learned. So some really smart guy tweeted this once. It's important to have definitions of product success that aren't too rigid, otherwise you'll feel crappy all the time. That person was me, and yes, I favorited my own tweet. I worked on a project for an entire year that was like ostensibly a failure until I realized that my team had applied what we learned to the real problem that needed to be solved, and ultimately that product was a success. So was the first product a failure? No, we learned the things necessary to succeed later. Therefore, learning can in and of itself be a successful outcome of a project. So this is something I want to talk about briefly, which is prototyping. So prototyping is how you sort of avoid the Tom Cruise situation. I want to examine prototyping because I think it's a crucial skill for designers and one that developers are already really good at. It's the ability to model something in an interactive or realistic way that's testable, either by itself, your team, or your people using your product. It's about being scrappy and distilling your ideas in its essence in order to learn as fast as possible. So you want to test and execute, which is like filling in the gaps between UI states. So if you have like a photo and you tap it and it expands, if a designer gives you 2 mocks, there's like a whole world between there they're not articulating. Prototyping can help with that. Prototyping helps explore and try entirely new directions, kind of that divergent thinking we're talking about. Also, prototyping helps communicate your ideas to your team and build consensus and get buy-in. So how do we prototype? There is a gentleman here who works for a great company called Framer, which is my preferred prototyping tool. And these are all examples of things I've made in Framer. But basically, Framer is like a tool to allow you to, it's for design prototyping. I'm sure you'll get a demo of it from him. But this allows designers to be able to actually capture their ideas in interactive form in a way that they might not be able to otherwise. So yeah, these are all examples of random things I've built either for work or for teaching Framer. I help teach internally. I very much encourage designers at Facebook to program and help them learn. Yeah, another tool, here's one that Facebook makes and a lot of our designers use called Origami Studio. And then examples of prototyping success. This is an article I'd recommend folks read by a guy named Paul. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. He's a nice guy. Everyone calls him Stammy. But this is like a key insight I found from his article, which is he talks about the designing Twitter video and this progress meter. And he said this interesting thing, which is with a 30-second time limit, people feel like they need to fill it up, which is an interesting example because you realize that every design decision you make, however trivial, ultimately results in some outcome. You can imagine why Twitter doesn't want people to take 30-second videos. They want them to take video of what they want to take video of. Maybe it's 5 seconds. They shouldn't feel the need to fill it up. Also, they don't want to destroy their servers and spend 6 times as much on hosting video as they need to, right? And I love that he calls this out in the article. But again, these are examples of intentional design process, that a progress meter may seem small, but it has huge outcomes on the actual effect of the product. So if we look carefully, we realize that we're back where we started. In the case of Stammy, he might reapply that learning to sort of restart the process. So we're feeding our insight back into understanding to clarify the problem. So your ship builds can be directly tested against the measure of success you outlined at the start, and if they don't meet those measures, you have research methodologies we've outlined. So in conclusion, armed with the design process, methodologies, and research, try incorporating some of this into your product development process. If we look at all the things we've discussed here, these are all things you have at your disposal. I'm not asking you all to become designers overnight, but I'm passionate about the ways in which my craft can help all of us who have the privilege of making things for people to do it more effectively. These are all things a product designer is either doing proactively or collaborating with another team to achieve. So I thank you all as engineers for providing me tools to do my job, and I hope that I've shared some useful ones with you. There's a document. I actually was inspired by collecting these resources for kind of non-designers to make a website eventually, but right now it's just a Google Doc. So if you click this, it just opens a Google Doc that is basically a lot of the things I referenced in here, but eventually it will just be some web app that allows you to sort and go through different, oh wait, you can't see this, can you? There we go. Anyway, it's literally just a Google Doc, but I would encourage folks to check it out. There's a link to this presentation, some of the writings I've referenced and found influential, some talks, including one by a guy named Brett Victor that will blow your mind. and other things I find to be generally useful. So anyway, I thank everyone for your time, and thank you Code Mobile for having me. This has been great.